Good evening, everyone. A warm welcome to Metamorphoses, a joint initiative by NITI Aayog, Center for Policy Research, and India International Center. We have gathered here today for the fourth program in the series, which is on vocabulary of the digital. The focus of today's discussion will be on the new and sometimes arcane vocabulary associated with the new digital technologies, which only the expert and the initiated understand.
Siri, who are you?
I am your digital personal assistant powered by artificial intelligence or AI.
What is artificial intelligence?
It is technology that enables machines to learn from their environment to act like human beings. AI can suggest movie options as per your interest. It can organize your mails into important and spam folders, and suggest restaurants customized to your preference. Beyond this simple usage, AI is now being used to develop self-driving cars, and even replicate phone conversations sitting in for users. The scope is vast.
But the increasing use of AI also raises ethical and legal questions. For example, who is responsible for damages caused by a self-driving car? In case of an unavoidable accident, who does the AI save? The people in the car or those on the road? Can AI cover the full complexity of human emotions? And most importantly, can it replace human decision making?
The reason why we have been doing this series on Metamorphoses is really to try and see how we can start bridging the gap between technological advance, which brings many, many benefits to humanity, but also, as we saw, can have some adverse consequences as well. And dealing with those adverse consequences, of course, is an issue of public policy. So we have already had a number of interactions under Metamorphoses, and I'm very happy that today we have a very distinguished speaker with us. This is Dr. Vijay Raghavan, who's the principal scientific advisor to the government, but someone who is a very accomplished, very person, very acclaimed as one of India's foremost scientists. The reason why I invited him to speak to us this evening is because we have very good scientists, but not all scientists are able to articulate the knowledge that they have, tremendous knowledge they have, in terms that ordinary people like us can understand. And I think he's one of those rare scientists that we have who is able to put very complex ideas into more simple terms, understandable terms. And that is what Metamorphosis is all about. What we will be doing is, I will first request Dr. Vijay Raghavan to make some opening remarks, give us a sense of how he looks at this technology space, and the kind of social impacts, the kind of human impacts it is having. The whole language sometimes becomes a means of creating sort of esoteric groups and keeping people out. If you can't master the jargon, you are effectively marginalized. So part of the challenge is how do we bridge that gap, so that whether we are talking about algorithms or artificial intelligence or big data or machine learning, all these are terms which we hear bandied about, but we don't have much understanding of what this is all about. And much more important than that, as I said, all this fantastic new technology, what are the implications of these technologies, both in terms of expanding the huge opportunities that they bring to us. I don't think we should forget about that new technology is something to be welcomed because it makes life so much easier. Many of the challenges that we face, this new technology is actually enabling us to overcome many of those challenges. But at the same time, there are issues involved with respect to the consequences. The very rapidity of the change has consequences in terms of how in society we interact with one another, how individuals interact with one another. So life itself is getting complicated. So I will now request Professor Vijay Raghavan to share his thoughts with us. After he has spoken, we will take just a few minutes to reset the stage for Dr. Vijay Raghavan to have a very easygoing conversation with four very accomplished individuals who are, experts in their own right in various aspects of the digital economy. And through this conversation, we hope that you will have a better understanding of the new technological age that has dawned upon us. And then we can have some questions from the audience. I think there is a particular procedure that we follow with respect to question and answers, and then we will end with that. Thank you very much for your attention, and may I now request Dr. Vijay Raghavan to please take the floor.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Shyam Saran, and good evening to all of you, and it's a great honor and privilege to be here, though the task the Ambassador has set is a very difficult one, claiming that I can communicate. So it's flattering, but it borders on fake news. But we'll see. The principal challenge we face today is not just the advent of technologies which there is a fear that somehow they will change our culture, our moorings, and so on and so forth. But it really is about potentially what is thought of as a new technology, where machines can have the same capabilities in every manner which humans have, and therefore there's a potential that they will take over our planet. There are some people who are familiar with technology who believe this is a real problem, and a significant number of others believe that they dismiss that. So the question is this really something which is meaningful and something to be worried about? So is there therefore a qualitative difference in our concerns about technology as opposed to a mere quantitative one? After all, when written language came about, when print came about, when radio and television came about, there were these kinds of fears that somehow it's going to upset the whole planet. But this, people say, is different. So how did the vocabulary of the digital came about? It came about by our own vocabulary developing, and we must look at our vocabulary in a broader context of all life on Earth. And this is something which is important and therefore bears repeating, that all life on this planet is linked to all other life forms. Every aspect of life is linked. At this wall of t is equal to 0, we had evolution of, at first approximation, single cellular organisms taking place. And they had a chemistry, they had a language, they had a vocabulary. They had to survive, they had to propagate, and they had to communicate. Those single cellular organisms occupied all life on this planet. But as time went by, through accident upon accident, over hundreds of millions of years of evolution, complex organisms evolved, and we are one example of a very complex organism, multicellular, but also having a language, a vocabulary, and communicating. And right from there to here, all life on this planet is linked together by a shared chemistry. So there's a shared vocabulary, and that shared chemistry is through the thread of DNA. And therefore, by studying and understanding any organism on this planet, you are effectively and in reality studying and trying to understand any other organism which exists and which has existed. And this is something to keep in mind. Now, one of the peculiarities of us as organisms is that we have rapidly moved away from this chemistry. This move from this chemistry was not initially rapid, but it came about by a series of accidents during evolution. Our ability to oppose thumb and forefinger was one. Our ability to use fire to cook and therefore compress nutrition into very small packets of highly nutritive food, so that allowed and gave the energy, is one hypothesis, for our brains to expand disproportionate to our body, unlike that of other large primates whose brains have not proportionately expanded and also in new regions, and therefore allowed the ability of over-design of the brain so that new capabilities could be used. Our ability to speak, linked with this ability to make tools, and this brain has resulted in something truly extraordinary, which Richard Dawkins calls the extended phenotype. We are no longer a consequence of our biology, but we have an expression of that biology in complex social systems which have effect on each other, on the ecology, and more recently on the planet as a whole. There's a lot of debate about when this extended phenotype started impacting the planet into an age which is called the Anthropocene. Some people say that this started with when humans went into agriculture. Others say that this started in New Mexico when humans first exploded the atomic bomb. But in whatever your dates are, the Anthropocene is on us. And we are now in a situation where humans are no longer the consequences of someone painting on the canvas of this planet, but we are the painters, we wield the paintbrush. In wielding the paintbrush, we have done extraordinary things, we have created new technologies. How does that happen? Our brain cells, our brain is composed of neurons, nerve cells, which talk to each other. And just as all of us share chemistry with the smallest of organisms, our brains share the same kinds of function with the smallest of organisms which have nerve cells. Nerve cells receive signals and communicate to other cells. And this is the same principle which is there in engineering today in all our devices which we communicate. But the way that communication takes place is not digital, it's through chemistry. And the exact same chemistry, pretty much, with some details being different in different cases, is the same way in which the worm communicates as well as the elephant communicates. So small circuits and large circuits use the same chemistry for functioning. The circuits which we use, which allow us to be conscious and use language and use abstractions, are composed of the exact same nuts and bolts and rivets which the circuit a small worm uses to negotiate to find odors. How then, despite the chemistry being identical, there being no difference in the chemistry essentially, does this large brain of ours behave in a manner which is more complex than other brains? It's not merely size, people say, because there are other large circuits. How does consciousness, our ability to speak and have abstractions come about? Now, there are two components to this. One is biological and one is engineering. From the biological point of view, there are two viewpoints. One, that the emergence of consciousness is a deep problem, i.e., it involves new principles which we don't know. And some philosophers, some neurophilosophers have this viewpoint that it's a deep problem and we don't know how to address it. Other philosophers say it's merely a software issue and it's completely understandable with all the information we have right now. And they use certain ways of explaining this, which I won't go into now, it's a separate talk. But basically they say that our ability to see each other, to have abstractions and so on, are emergent properties of neural circuits. And just as complex computers do extraordinary feats of computation based on their software, it would be wrong to search for intrinsic properties in their hardware to explain that. Similarly, it would be wrong to search for seats of consciousness or some intrinsic property in the brain which does it. These are all computational outcomes. The problem I have with the first viewpoint, that this is a hard problem, that there's a new language, is it effectively makes a divine appeal. And historically in biology, this has been made time and again. Can we explain heredity? Now, there's a way, you can say that, you have to go into genetics, evolution, and so on, and explain it. Or you can make a claim that this is something given. And similarly, to explain consciousness as a hard problem, to me seems intellectually appealing to a solution which is not easy to dispute and therefore complex to discuss. But be that as it may, there still may be complexities, abstractions which you're not aware of and which may or may not discover. Now, if it is an explainable problem, the emergence of consciousness, then, in principle, should we not be able to construct a machine which has all the properties of the conscious? That problem was first posed in a concise manner by Alan Turing, whose death anniversary, I think, was very recently, a few weeks ago. And Turing, during the Second World War, was working to crack the Nazi code at a place called Benchley, and he used to commute to Cambridge to talk to his intellectual colleagues and to London to talk to his administrative colleagues. And both ways he used to run. He was a marathon runner. And he discovered, or he posed, three major ways of looking at critical problems. One was to ask, how does pattern emerge in biology? How do all the complexities of life we see, how do they come about? And that he proposed a solution through chemical reactions. And they are relevant to the kinds of machines we have, but we won't go into that. The second point, second problem he addressed was one of computing numbers, and basically pointed out, and that's relevant here, that if you had sufficient memory and you had an algorithm, then you could pretty much compute anything. So this was very important in the theory of computing numbers, and he invented the Turing machine, which was a theoretical machine which could do this. Von Neumann, another famous computer scientist, said that this machine, if you could replicate it, then you could have more and more Turing machines. And if during replication this machine made errors in replication, you had mutations, and therefore you had a diversity of machines. So the von Neumann computer basically had an ability to replicate the Turing machine, but also mimicked in somewhat real life, where replication of life forms takes place, but you have mutations which result in diversity. The third contribution from Turing was in artificial intelligence, and he asked, to paraphrase, whether amongst you there is someone or some people who are actually machines. What is the test we would do to figure out whether you are a human or a machine? How can I interrogate you to reveal truly that if I open up your brain, you're full of wires and not neurons, right? And that is a challenge. How do you interrogate this machine? And therefore, there are lots of algorithms which you can use to test that. But the point is that in theory, is it possible to make such a person who is not a zombie, or rather a zombie which is not identifiable as a zombie? Today, we have, and I'll finish because it's important that we have questions and we can talk to others. We have two major challenges related to what AI and the Turing computer have brought us to today. One is an issue in decision making. Do we have a connection with our technologies which is increasing to such an extent and qualitatively distinct from our reliance on facts, on library, on books, on data? Do we have a reliance which is qualitatively jumped from that onto our prosthetics, our machines, in such a manner that they actually do the decision making for us? That we are unable to take complex decisions. We press various buttons, we get various data, and the machine says, do this under these circumstances, and we do that. Are we heading towards that state in a manner which is distinct from all previous predictions of doom which were there when we were supposed to be doing this for all sorts of reasons. People said this when libraries came into existence. The second aspect relates to consciousness. Are we going to create machines which actually take decisions which are more complex, autonomously, in a manner which we would otherwise be taking? Would a machine say that a given war or a given decision or a given relationship with the World Bank is wise, and does a machine sit in cabinet meetings? Why not, if it can take informed decisions no different from us? Why should machines not have rights if they can take these decisions in a manner which is perfectly indistinguishable from us? Is that theoretically possible? And if so, what should we do? Now, as I said, there are two views on this, on both these matters. And both of them, I think, come from relatively uninformed in terms of data and their analysis. And therefore, it's difficult to say which side is right or wrong. One view is that so far, technology has never, that's our view, but we don't know, technology has never overtaken our decision-making to such an extent that we can't just pull the plug and stop it. So one group of philosophers says, what's the big deal? If you have a machine which is controlling you, turn off the power. You're done. These things work on power. Don't feed it. The other view is that you can't do that. This is just a runaway system which is very, very complex. So I really don't know what the data is. Both sides go by a gut feeling based on extrapolations which are reasonable in one side's view and unreasonable in the others about the past. But we are truly entering into a complex situation now, which these kinds of machines can do extraordinary things which were not feasible earlier. I'd like to end by giving you two examples, one which you're all familiar with, how computers are beating the best humans in chess as well as in Go, the Japanese game. And they're doing this, they used to do this by actually playing some games with masters and then learning and getting better. Now the next generation computers play those games with themselves before they meet the master for the first time, and they can effectively beat the master right away the first time. This is not unusual in biology. Mountain goats, when they're born, can run up the steepest slopes. That's because they practice during fetal development. Their nervous system simulates the real world and practices. So similarly, a fruit fly, when it emerges, can take off and fly. It doesn't go to flight school. So biology has done this all along. Computers are now doing this at our behest. This, the second example with computers, relates to a very long-standing problem in biology, how extremely complex long molecules called proteins fold into specific balls. And the way they fold depends on the sequence. And it's been an impossibly difficult task for theoreticians and experimentalists to predict how each different string folds in a particular different manner. There's a hedge fund owner in America, in Manhattan, Shaw, and David Shaw has started a company which made a computer called Anton. And Anton can take any protein and predict what it'll fold to by its enormous computing power and by its memory. But Anton can do nothing else. Anton just folds proteins because its firmware is designed in such a manner, and it does this. Our attempts at artificial intelligence and so on will result in these kinds of dedicated machines which can do specific tasks really well and learn, but also generalists, like some of our Foreign Service and IIS colleagues, who can do many tasks, sometimes well, oftentimes well. So this mixture of specialists and generalists are going to be extraordinarily powerful in our decision making, and it remains to be seen how they will play out in our future. But whichever side you are on, the fact that they'll have a huge impact is without doubt. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor, for such an enlightening presentation. Now, before our panel joins Dr. Raghavan on the dais, let me briefly familiarize you with their expertise. Our first panelist, Professor Gagandeep Kang, is the Executive Director of Translational Health Science Technology Institute, an autonomous institute of the Department of Biotechnology. Prior to joining this department, Professor Kang was a professor and head of the Wellcome Trust Research Laboratory and the Division of Gastrointestinal Sciences at the Christian Medical College in Vellore. Our second panelist, Ms. Mahima Kaul, heads Public Policy for Twitter India. Her role includes managing the Twitter for Good program in India and also the recently launched Position of Strength program. Previously, she headed the Cyber and Media Initiative at the Observer Researcher Foundation, New Delhi. Our third panelist, Mr. Abhishek Pitti, is the co-founder and CEO of Nucleus Vision. He dropped out of Harvard Business School to launch Nucleus Vision, formerly Bellboy Inc. Nucleus Vision is an IoT-based customer identification platform that allows brick-and-mortar retailers to identify any customer who walks into a store in real time using Nucleus Vision's proprietary ion sensor technology. Our fourth panelist, Mr. Dhruv Arora, works with the Central Communications team at the Center for Policy Research as the Manager, Digital and Strategic Communication. He has previously worked as the Head of Engagement with Youth Ki Awaaz, as well as in various development organizations such as Kriya and Commutiny, the Youth Collective.
Start now? And thank you very much for all of you for being here. We've had one previous discussion on telephone and another more interesting one before we came here. And the net result of that is that we are full of trepidation and worried about the kinds of questions you'll ask us. One way for the panelists to be prepared for all your questions is to give them some time, but put one person on the spot to get started. And so, Gagandeep, if you can get started with your views on how in the health and biomedical sector broadly, AI and machine learning are impacting decision making. Is that going to remove a human interface in these decisions? And are we going to be able to do everything digitally in terms of what's right or wrong with us and what treatment we need?
Thank you, Vijay. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. So I'm not a digital expert, but nowadays if you're in academic medicine and you do not work with digital technologies, you're in effect useless. And this is something that really started changing about 25 years ago. And this was with the advent of electronic health records. It didn't take long for the Western countries to come up with this. It was slower in India in general, but now practically every medical facility you look at maintains information on its patients electronically, and the more complete the records are, the easier it becomes for people to follow the history of a patient and manage them. Along with that came other technologies, and all of medicine is now about technology. Whether you're a diabetic whose blood sugars are being monitored on a regular basis and communicated to your endocrinologist by, now there are apps that you can use to communicate with your doctors. Whether you use this for diagnosis, so one is to look at compliance, but also now for diagnosis, technology is everywhere. Radiologists who look at X-rays now are looking at, can they use technologies to be able to reduce the need for radiologists at all? And here you encounter a problem. Everybody here knows what an X-ray is. How do you know what's normal? Right? It takes a long time for people in medicine or in radiology or anybody who looks at image recognition to identify what normal is in human beings. If you are male, if you are female, if you are old, if you are young, if your back is slightly more bent than somebody else, your x-rays are all going to be different. And this is just chest x-rays that we are talking about. So how do you define what normal is? And here is where you use learning techniques. So you can train machines to learn by showing them lots and lots and lots of normal. But here you need to define, are you doing this to be able to screen so that if there is something abnormal, you can pick it up? Or are you doing this to make a diagnosis where you don't want to go wrong? So this is defining the sensitivity or the specificity. Do I find the true positives by making sure that I pick up everybody who might have something wrong with them? Or do I make an accurate diagnosis by eliminating all those who don't have a problem? But these are things that people have begun to work on now with some level of success. Are we there yet? Not quite, but we are getting there. So I'll stop with the ideas of, being able to monitor compliance and being able to make a diagnosis, and perhaps I'll come back to this at a later stage.
Mahima? Is Mahima next?
Yes, actually, it would be good if we can. Yeah. So this is Dhruv. Just to sort of give an introduction to the kind of work that Mahima is doing and the kind of work that I'm doing. Mahima works with Twitter, so her primary focus is public policy in the context of Twitter in India. She heads that. And it'll be really interesting, in my opinion, sir, please add, to understand how Twitter has been innovating, how Twitter's usage has evolved over time, and especially in terms of political discourse, how Twitter has had an impact on the global world.
Thank you, Mahima. This is a very non-controversial topic.
Yeah, no, so what I can do, actually, thank you for setting that up, is maybe just talk a little bit about not just Twitter, but social media in general. We are, I think, in year 13 or 14 of Facebook, and 1 year after Facebook was launched, Twitter was launched. And if you think about it, it's not a very long time to have social media apps such as these. And the design of these apps has actually changed the entire way in which we communicate with each other. So if an app is a private app, for example, and it allows you to, if you all think of WhatsApp, for example, right? When WhatsApp actually introduced the functionality of sending PDFs, it changed in its tenor somewhat to become almost a workspace. If you look at Twitter, we're an open platform. So what happens is that I can tweet something right now. Somebody sitting in Bombay can like that tweet. Somebody in New York can retweet it. Somebody in Africa can, quote retweet it. So the way we are actually talking to each other is completely changed. The other aspect of it, which I think we all know, but it's something to marvel at also, is that it has allowed everybody to actually communicate their point of view. And it's inverted that pyramid somewhat. If you look at information dissemination, previously you could think of it as a pyramid where information came from limited sources and it was disseminated and we all consumed the same thing all the time. What's happening now is that we have millions and millions of users. Twitter's still got less users and we're still in the 300 millions. And of course, other apps, somewhat have a larger number of users. And we are all able to express ourselves and we're all able to consume various sources of information which were not previously available to us. Coming to governance, and similar to the point that you mentioned, the first wave of digitization was really digitizing records. I mean, it was literally taking all those paper files that were lying in offices and digitizing them. We're now sort of looking at the second wave, which is that the government can actually talk to you in real time and perhaps even solve your problems in real time. So those experiments are underway, and I think the access that citizens have to public officials and to governments have changed the power dynamics quite substantially, but of course, brought its own equal number of challenges when you have that much freedom and you've got apps in which you can communicate quite freely with each other. So maybe I'll sort of end there and we can raise some questions, yeah.
Thank you very much, Mahima. And I'd like to move on to Dhruv, from some of the points which Mahima raised. One is, she pointed out that when you tweet something, people all over the world can see it. But also, you can make it in such a manner that you see tweets from only a certain set of viewpoints. And you can rapidly move into an echo chamber where the only views you listen to are views which you like. And that's happened with Facebook also, and Dhruv can add on to that.
Sure. I think, thank you so much for setting that up. I think this discussion about algorithms, I think we all saw the video as well. I think it's important to first define what algorithms are in context of social media, and then we can move on to how sort of, as Sir mentioned, the echo chambers can be formed and how the discussion can actually be isolated. Now, algorithms in a sense are just essentially a formula in which how people see content is decided. So what a lot of people don't know, and in fact, I think I was just reading a recent study mentioned that about 60% of Facebook's population is not aware that their content is curated in any way, right? They, we believe as users of Facebook that we have a list of friends, and we have 50 friends, and we're following 20 pages, and as soon as somebody posts something, we'll see it. That's actually far from the truth. The way it works is that there is a set of formulas, there is a set of instructions that Facebook's algorithm follows. It looks at the kind of things that you've been engaging with, it looks at the kind of things that you've been interacting with, and it tries to show you more of that. And the reason it does that is so that your engagement is increased. Now, while this sounds interesting on the outset, the problem with this becomes that there is an opportunity for Facebook then to show me a lot more content of which I agree with, and not enough content that I may disagree with. Now that may put me in a bubble, like similar to how the video pointed out, that may put me in a political bubble, for example. If I subscribe to a specific train of thought as far as my politics is concerned, I may not get as much exposure to the other side, which is it's actually a very good example is what happened in the United States elections recently. I mean, if you look at the way things worked there, there was actually a very large liberal echo chamber that was created where the idea was that there is absolutely no way that the result of the election would be as it has turned out. And it was being propagated so hard that the conversation between the two sides completely stopped. And therefore, there was a sense of surprise that everybody was really taken aback when the results came out. But the fact of the matter is, we need to look at what is causing this. And I should point out that Facebook's algorithms are much more active in terms of how data is sorted, because Twitter, I believe, still works in real time. So if somebody posts something, I see it right then. But it is important to understand that even today, even in the current political discourse, and it's even more relevant now that we're looking at the 2019 elections, and it's very relevant for us to know this, how algorithms can play a part, and how we consciously may need to make an effort to hear the other side. That is something that these binaries sort of threaten. Yeah.
Thank you, Dhruv. Abhishek is from the tech industry, as it were, and should therefore be a very strong proponent of more and more tech and its applications and its use. And as has happened all over the world, some of the most good advice and analysis about the promises and perils of technology have come from people deep in technology. And they are well analyzed and sometimes better than those from outside. So Abhishek, your views on how tech is going?
Sure. Thank you, everyone. I think I can speak from the visionary standpoint. I've spent several years in Silicon Valley interacting with venture capitalists, people who are serial entrepreneurs, people who sort of envisage the outcomes of these technologies. And I can't resist but talk about the vision that and reflect on what Ms. Kang was saying. That when the future of machine learning in healthcare, for example, is that when you go to a diagnostic center for taking a result of your radiology diagnosis, and if the doctor says, this is my interpretation, you would be like, has the computer checked it? Have you gotten the consultation of the computer versus yours? So the evolution would be, there's so much historical data analysis that will go through these scans, and interpretation will be done based on so much of historical data that eventually the perception of what is the fair outcome or what is the right interpretation, we would start believing the computers more than people. That was some of the visions that people have talked about. Now, as far as I'm here to talk about blockchain as a technology, and I think the video was more confusing than actually it is. So I think to simplify it, frankly,
He's the only one who can explain blockchain.
I think I'll try to break it down, not for the technology, but what it really means and why it is so important and why you should know about it. Just so you know, blockchain is probably the richest technology domain at the moment, and here's why, right? In February 2017, the amount of capital infusion in this space was about $19 billion globally. February 2018, that number spiked to almost $475 billion. That is the kind of capital infusion that has happened globally. And you may ask why, right? And I think a simple way to understand blockchain technology is it takes out the middleman. That's what it does, essentially. That's the job of blockchain. And how it does that, it basically facilitates a transaction with the use of a code and automates that transaction. And why is it so successful? Because it is a trustless system by the nature of the characteristics of how the technology is structured. And when I say trustless, so for example, if I tell you sun rises in the east, right, you don't have to trust me. It's factually correct, and it just creates, you don't have to put any trust in the system. For example, if Amazon is selling you something, you have to trust Amazon that that's right. But in case of blockchain, that trust is out of the system. You don't have to trust the system anymore. It's correct by itself. So there are a few characteristics that makes it trustless system, which is immutability. That means you cannot stop the system by updating what it does. Number two, it's auditable. Anybody can audit that system. It's distributed. For you to shut down a blockchain, you have to shut down the internet, or you need to shut down all the nodes, what they call it. So there are a few key characteristics that makes it so powerful. So let's understand who gets disrupted, right? Who are the middlemen we are talking about? In the last century, we have created middlemen like the Googles, the Airbnbs, the Olas, the banks, the governments, the insurance companies. Anybody who is facilitating a transaction is a middleman. And blockchain, if not adopted by these entities, will disrupt and take those middlemen out. So that's why it's so much more powerful. Anybody who is a middleman will get disrupted. Think about it, your day-to-day jobs. If you're a broker in a transaction, you will get disrupted. So it's here to stay. It's as big as, the experts in the Valley forecast that this would be as big as internet in terms of revolutions. So it's very important that we understand this technology because it's going to penetrate all fabrics of technology going forward.
Please.
Actually, I think it might be interesting if, I think every time we've heard of the idea of blockchain, we've heard it in the context of cryptocurrencies, right? Now that really locks in what a lot of people think about blockchain. Is it just a currency? Is that the limit of where we are when we think about blockchain, or is there more to it? Because I think that will be really interesting to explore. What are the other ways in which blockchain can really influence industry?
So, frankly, I think currency is one of the biggest applications that has been explored so far. Blockchain is a technology that powers it, but just to simplify again for the sake of the audience, I think if you look at Windows as an operating system, everybody, how many people use computers? Probably knows what Windows are, right? So Windows is an operating system, and Excel is an application, right? So Windows software is what I'm talking about, the Windows operating system that, just to clarify again, Bill Gates have made for all of us. And likewise, you have Apple Macintosh as a, iOS as a operating system. And then Excel, Windows Excel, or Microsoft Excel is an application top of it. So I would think of blockchain as the Windows and currency as an application like Microsoft Excel. So it has been one of the most used applications. It has been one of the first ones which people know today as Bitcoin, has been a currency, but that's the difference. I think the blockchain is the underlying platform that can be applied to various industries. Now, the question is, for example, continuing the example of healthcare as an industry, you can digitize and secure all the patient records, for example. The supply chain for all the medical devices can be further enhanced. all the way from, insurance claim adjudication to anything that needs traceability and visibility can be improved using blockchain.
And I hear the government of India is also experimenting with land rights records.
Yeah, I think the biggest use case so far explored has been the land records because I think there is a need for making sure there is a traceability of ownership. And blockchain allows you to do that. And I think that is one of the biggest use cases so far.
So, I have a question which relates to Twitter and healthcare, and then we'll come back to blockchain possibly as an application in that domain. Given that digital solutions to healthcare questions are available and people can tweet and talk about them in real time, again, is there a qualitative difference between that and, let's say, a blood test or a biochemistry test of the past? Earlier too, doctors used to make decisions without recourse to any X-ray or blood tests. Now they have those tests available. Patients will ask them, have you done these tests, if the doctors don't do it? How is this any different? Is there a qualitative difference, or is it just merely a quantitative change?
So how we can investigate biology has changed completely with new technologies. So right now, when you did a blood test, you usually measure 1, 3, or 5 things, and that tells you about, do you have anemia? Is your liver functioning all right? What's your lipid profile like? So you know how your liver is handling those, as well as what your diet has been. But the technologies we have today are technologies that are allowing us to investigate much, much more about a person. So with genomics, you will get the genetic profile of a person. If you take serum from a person, you can look at a proteomic or a metabolomic profile that allows you to measure much more than we were ever able to measure before. And if you can integrate different sources of information, you can make actually not just a diagnosis, but also a prediction about somebody who is well today, but might get sick in 3 or 5 years down the line. So the power of new technologies allows for both better measurement and better integration of information. And what new tools are allowing us to do is to be able to analyze more and more data to make those predictions much more accurately. So I think there's both a qualitative difference in what we do as well as a quantitative difference.
That brings me to the point about privacy of data related to decision making and the robustness of that security. First of all, isn't there a fundamental problem, which is a conflation between precision and accuracy? You're getting more and more data. You can be very, very precise about the data you collect and completely inaccurate. Just by getting all the genetic sequence information, gene expression pattern, and lifestyle of a person, is it maybe very precise? Is it going to inform on a 3-month or a 6-month prognosis in a real world where things keep dynamically changing?
So I think there is a bias. A lot depends on what you put in. For example, for all cancers, we know a lot about all cancers that happen in the West, and we don't necessarily know a lot about all the cancers that happen in India because we don't have data from India. So there is a bias because what you put in will influence what you get out. There's also issues of ethics. Could you potentially be misclassifying people because you had the wrong kind of input data? So it's not just about data security, but it's about how that data influences decisions that are made about that person.
Just a quick point. The very important point coming out is, unlike in previous situations where you just had the data, this data set today, because of AI and machine learning, can learn to get better and better with use. And therefore, there's a tendency to be more and more accurate, moving from mere precision to also being accurate. And the security of that data is therefore very, very important.
So I think now, as when you're talking about Twitter, I think what would be very interesting to also delve into a little bit is, this idea of Twitter diplomacy. I think that is something that has really come up over the past at least 5 years, and we see that a lot, especially with say Donald Trump's Twitter handle is quite entertaining, to say the least. But that raises a very interesting question: how, in this current age of social media, how does diplomacy? How is that affected? How does that sort of change?
So before I answer that, I'll just carry on the health conversation for just a minute. I think what the opportunity also with social media and with people actually putting out posts that might offer different kinds of data sets, especially if you look at an open platform like Twitter, is that you can actually have access to large pools of information that you can actually use, anonymized data sets, for example, to actually do a little bit of a deep dive into public health issues. So, for example, if you come back to the algorithms that we were talking about, if suddenly in a certain place, what starts trending is something to do with a disease or something to do with, waterborne issues, you can actually have a very early indication of a problem that might be starting. Or after a situation is over, maybe there was a public health issue, you can actually go back into the data and see if there were any indicators of people tweeting, individuals tweeting things that now when you put together, you can figure out as early warning signs. And so, moving away from health for a second, if you look at even, sort of disaster-prone areas, you can see, for example, in the case of urban flooding, because in urban areas, a lot more people have access to social media, people are tracking those kind of conversations to see that if a lot of people are talking about water level rising, then can that give us an early indication, which can then translate into a public message going out saying, you need to stay indoors because there is something changing. So I think, the algorithm then comes into play because you can actually surface what everyone is talking about at any given point of time. And these big conversations can actually lead to some good as long as the data is sort of used correctly. And
Absolutely.
yeah, and so, I think, and of course, on the diplomacy angle, of course, I think the entire context and the way we are conducting, relations between countries and certainly even within a country is changing because of the immediate nature. And as we were discussing a little bit before the panel, earlier you would have to go through a complete PR exercise for an individual or a government to be able to say something in public, to move the needle on a narrative or a relationship. And now you need only have your phone with you at 3 o'clock in the morning and completely change the way the international world order is structured. So yeah, it has definitely thrown up a lot of challenges, but I think a lot of opportunity for people to get involved and give real-time feedback as well as to what they think about developments as they happen. Yeah.
So I've been politely nudged from the floor that we should get on to the questions now. And I'm sure we have lots of interesting questions which have come by SMS. So would you like to start, Angela?
So there are some philosophical questions, of course. And because I have the mic, I have the privilege of asking questions myself as well. So, talking about machines taking over, becoming ubiquitous in our lives, Govind has asked the question, will we then start thinking of rights for machines as well, if they become ubiquitous? And I have a question for Dhruv and Mahima around information dissemination in the age of social media and Twitter. And one of the key questions today revolves around fake news and online safety. And I know it's a challenge right now. I know the Twitter Safety Summit is probably going to happen in the US now. So what is it that can be done in the online space to create safe spaces for conversation which is dying, especially for the youth, in a post-truth world? And then I'll come to more questions.
So, well, the question about rights for machines, maybe Abhishek, you should take a shot at that. I've given the question, but it would be good to get a tech answer to that.
Yeah, I think, there are arguments to be made on both sides, right? Elon Musk thinks, the left side, and some people think the right side. And clearly, a lot of people are trying to innovate, and so we're trying to go to the right side. But I think there are opinions from people like Elon who thinks that AI would be our worst invention, and towards something that would unleash some of the things that would probably be jeopardizing our rights as human or mankind. But at this other side is that this should be controlled, and if this can be controlled, there will be obviously a framework that has to be created for these things to operate, and especially people who are inventing them try to put this control framework over it, as well as do it early on versus late in the game. I think that's the awareness that some of the governance bodies have to sort of pay attention to, because sometimes it's just too late to put these frameworks around it. But I think as far as the kind of innovation that is happening at the moment, we are going towards a situation where there will be a lot of capital put behind it, there will be a lot of resources put behind it, there will be innovations that will lead. So my opinion is the sooner the better. We think as governance bodies to put a framework where people who are innovating it put that as the integral nature of the technology when it's developed versus afterwards. Yeah.
Dhruv, you want to answer the second part?
I think online safety is something, it's a tricky space to talk about, just because this technology, I believe, is still evolving. I think this is relatively new in the history of even the internet. I mean, the internet is quite recent itself. And how do we deal with abuse online? I believe is that it links quite closely with how do you deal with abuse, period. I think it's very difficult, in my opinion, for a platform to take complete responsibility for dispersing abuse, for preventing abuse. Because on one hand, the idea is that is technology creating this abuse, or is it just propagating this abuse? So I think while there is a need to create safer spaces online, and that is happening, a lot of the organizations, including WhatsApp, I believe, is taking out a new feature just today, where the messages that are forwarded will have a sign on top that says this message has been forwarded, as opposed to this message being an original message that you received, which should help in a lot of cases, how these messages are received. And I'm sure you guys have heard about the lynchings that happened recently as well. So how do you differentiate between a message that is a forward, that is out with a negative intent, and how do you differentiate between a message which is genuine, is a concern that WhatsApp is trying to address? So I think while these features can help prevent abuse, it cannot necessarily be the only thing that we bank upon. And I think...
maybe Mahima can address this. In public spaces, we have certain norms of behavior. We don't seem to breach those norms, whether we are in the marketplace or in this hall, but we seem to be very ready to do that in the digital space. So could not the platform be somewhat also responsible?
Yeah, so I would actually turn that on its head. I think the initial thought with the internet was that was going to be a better version of ourselves. And the internet was going to be this ideal space where everyone was going to actually carve a better future. And I think that even if you take the experience of a lot of women, I mean, the misogyny that existed in the offline world followed online, and it wasn't really quite that ideal space that a lot of companies thought it would be. And so you're absolutely right. I think that if you look at like companies and you look at platforms and you look at information dissemination, obviously it works differently in different platforms. So Dhruv alluded to the fact that on Twitter you get your chronological timeline, right? If I follow three of you and you tweet at 10 a.m., that's when I get your message. You tweet at 10:10, that's when I get your message, right? So I get it in real time. But at the same time, if I go to bed at midnight and I wake up at 8 a.m., that's 8 hours worth of messages, and nobody actually wants to kind of go down that timeline and read that. So that's where you get algorithms in play who will then try and surface maybe the top few, and that's how the algorithms try and give you more of what you want. But yet, at the same time, the implications of what that can actually lead to, we saw in the election cycle last year. So the questions that I think platforms can ask themselves are, in three buckets. One is, what are our policies? And when you came up with the policies in 2005, this is what your impression of what the user and the usage was. Obviously, as years go by, you see changes in the way, the kinds of people who are using it and the kinds of usage that are happening, so you can evolve on the policies of the platform. The second is product features, right? Back in the day, everyone thought that you could block and mute and that would be enough. And obviously, as time has gone by, you realize that you need to give more and more control to the user, because I might want to read everything, but you might want to see very little of it, right? And so you need to be able to give the user a lot of tools in terms of how they want to experience any space or any public space or any conversation. And I think the third is the larger question of really what it reveals about us as a society, because I think that online and being online can surface a lot of issues that already existed. And yes, it can also give a lot of voice to voices previously unheard. And I think that's the issue that we're also dealing with. You can fix a product, but how do you deal with society?
So I'll ask 3 questions together to do with health, blockchain, and a larger question about digital economy. To do with the blockchain, Abhishek, middlemen or platforms not only facilitate but also take responsibility for failure. Who will assume responsibility and compensate if the transaction is not honored? And also you talked about governments being middlemen. So if you do away with governments, who actually executes the blockchain? Who takes responsibility? Who executes the blockchain technology? And as we know, the globe is governed by many forms of governance, democracy, monarchy, religious-based, etc. Does blockchain have the capacity to change or disrupt the governing system and bring some kind of uniformity by Sanjay Gupta? Should I move on to the health question, or do you want to answer this first?
Yes, maybe you can answer this. Yeah, I think. So I think I got the first 2, and maybe I'll ask you to repeat the last one. But okay. So I think when I was being very peripheral about how the technology works, right? When I say it automates a transaction, it now can include the intelligence of a decision making for a transaction into that code. So now we have created something called smart contracts. The smart contracts is a digital smart contract or digital contract where you can embed the intelligence required to make a decision. So now it's like, when a transaction is happening, the smart contract can validate what are the things that you want to validate before it executes the contract. So it's not like it's just somebody, facilitating a transaction with no intelligence. Now, this facilitation is happening with the intelligence that an entity would apply, whether it's a government, whether it's Amazon, whether it's whoever, right? So you can embed the intelligence in the contract. So that's what takes care of the facilitation part of it. Now, as far as the governments, when I say government, the government is a facilitator for multiple types of transactions, right? It could be whether distribution of food, whether it's insurance, whether it's several of these supply chains that exist within our ecosystem that government is responsible for. Now, what it means that when I said it could disrupt a lot of these, micro supply chains that exist within the government. So for example, government is trying to implement a healthcare program. So blockchain is one of the key pieces where you can make sure that any of these claims are educated by educated without any fraud. Now, earlier people were responsible to educate these claims, but now this can be done by a platform which can take out the entire fraud that could have been introduced by a human factor previously. So it's not, when I say government would get disrupted, but it's about things that government facilitate as a middleman towards the transaction. So last part, I
think the last question was that the globe is governed by many forms of governance systems like democracy, monarchy, religious-based, etc. Does blockchain have the capacity to change or disrupt the governing systems and bring some kind of uniformity, etc.? Sanjay Gupta.
I think, go ahead.
My question was, I think it's not legal, you're supposed to send an SMS.
Yeah, I've read out your question verbatim.
Yes, actually my idea was to just explain, we are governed by democracy, Pakistan is governed by religion-based.
He's got that,
He's got that.
So I think as far as the governance go, I think the new forms of applications of blockchains are still emerging. I think the decision making, what blockchain essentially does, it takes out the decision making from central authorities and make it more distributed among people. So I think like Twitter and Facebook are sort of distributing the the communication aspect of it. What blockchain does, it takes out the decision making from central authorities to people globally. And as these decentralization and distribution nature of applications will emerge, I think there will be a lot of legal and governance that would also emerge from the applications that might lead to decision making, that might lead to some of the governance of some parts of applications, not all of them. I think the interesting thing about blockchain, it's controlled by the network. It's not controlled by a central authority. Unless and until government takes the initiative to be facilitator of this network and they own the network. So that's the key thing that people need to understand about blockchain. Blockchain is much like internet. So if I ask you today, can you shut down the internet? The answer is no, because all of these nodes that are operating, you need to literally shut down all of these computers globally to shut down the internet. That's what blockchain is. It takes the decision making to such a level where you really need to shut down all the nodes. For example, Bitcoin today has 47 million nodes. If you want to shut down Bitcoin, you need to shut down 51% of all nodes, or in fact all of it, all of these users to shut down Bitcoin. So technically, the applications are still emerging, and the governance will be something that we have to keep a close eye on, that what applications will create that decision making.
This is a question for Professor Raghavan and Professor Kang. What, according to you, are the two crucial questions in government with regards to the future of biotechnology? What can think tanks do, if anything at all, to address these questions?
But is that a topic which we're discussing today?
It's written, it's for you and
Well, this is outside the purview of what we're talking today, unless you want to improve government administration by using AI, machine learning, and blockchain. That could be one application from the government end. But more importantly, the way biotechnology is changing, which Gagandeep alluded to, and all of science is changing, is the ability to collect data in real time, analyze it, and feed back to decision making. And that's an enormously positive application in certain contexts, such as if you look at our small and marginal farmers, their land holdings preclude large-scale decision-making which farmers in the US can use, but with current data collection technologies which can go to that fine level, analyze it and feed back in some mechanism, if the last mile interaction can be done, then decision-making on soil, water, seed, and market can go back to the ground level. So those are the kinds of applications, integrating a deep domain knowledge of life sciences with AI and machine learning in decision making. Gagandeep, any comment on that?
Let me ask a larger question around digital literacy and who controls the digital economy. There are a couple of questions which have asked that India is a country where majority are digital illiterates. So if education itself is at the bottom of the ladder, how can you ensure digital literacy for this development to take off for the people? And also, is this digital world giving people who own the digital technology, the corporates who are actually fueling it and funding it, the power to control things? In a democracy, how is it justifiable that people are becoming, or are people becoming slaves to digital corporates?
So I think the first thing I will say as far as this is concerned is that we must consider the nature of the internet. The internet by itself inherently is distributed, it's open, right? While there might be certain platforms which might have their own networks within the internet, but the internet itself cannot be monopolized. That's why it is so important, and that is why it is outside the ambit of an organization to take over what happens on the internet. So I think we must consider that when we're talking about the internet at large, while in the context to something like Facebook or even Twitter, I think Mahima would be able to explore, we can have discussions about how do we make sure that power structures do not get formed. At the internet at large, no such thing. There's no such problem that we're facing at least.
Can I actually take that from? Okay. So I actually work in Tamil Nadu and fairly rural Tamil Nadu. And I think, digital literacy is the first thing that people acquire. And the penetration of mobile phone technologies, and now with smartphones, and the ability of people to learn to use them to their advantage is something that we have not recognized sufficiently. Whether that is in health or in any other area, this is a source of information that people are using at every level of society. And this is only going to increase. So I would not call us digitally illiterate, and the few that aren't going to stay that way for long.
Yeah, sure, I can add a little bit to it because I also sort of deal a lot with the question of digital literacy. So I think I agree with you, ma'am. I think that there's a lot of, there is keypad literacy. I mean, if we all remember when cell phones, very expensive to make calls, everyone had figured out a system to give missed calls. My dad is here, so he used to give a missed call to say he's coming home for dinner soon, etc. So, people are able to adjust to new technologies and get what use they want out of it. But I think the issue of sort of media literacy, we have a program that we do with school teachers because we're also recognizing that you can't just keep going to the students, but you need to be able to kind of talk to the authority figures who they will turn to when they have some confusion. And some of the issues that we actually talk about is anonymity. It is privacy. It is sort of online bullying, these kind of issues that might be a little more up the food chain, I think, in some ways, are issues that need to be discussed with people who are living their lives on the internet. And so there are many programs, I think there are a lot of companies are doing, and so I think it's a work in progress. We don't have a set syllabus. Nobody has a set answer to how to discuss these issues, but there's certainly experiments underway. But yeah, those are, I think, very crucial issues. So
I'll kill the next question, which is about how this lack of literacy is increasing disparities. Let me come to the last question, maybe, to close the evening. And this is something we had to take out of the AI learning video we were making, but I'm glad it's asked. In a modern war, does not artificial intelligence take over human decision-making? For example, one may presume a missile shield will decide to hit back and not leave it to humans to decide. Sanat Kaul. I mean, who takes a decision in wartime?
So I don't know how many of you know of that instance when there was a Soviet submarine commander who had to take a split-second decision about whether to respond to a tense situation during the Cuban crisis by escalating it or not. More recently, there was a situation in the Soviet Union when the NATO command sent erroneously signals of an attack. That typically is cross-checked, and that cross-check again showed a nuclear attack. And the Soviet commander sitting there at that station, seeing these two instances of a verifiable attack, looked around him at the world at that time and said, this must be an error, and took a decision not to respond. This illustrates a very critical point. The evolved ability over hundreds of millions of time to take what in statistics would be called Bayesian statistics decisions is probably peculiar and unique to humans. So therefore, machines will take their decisions based on huge amount of data, but the ability to take a decision on little or no data is peculiarly human. Disengaging that can be dangerous.
Thank you.
Or it could be dangerous in either way.
Shall we end with the fact that machines don't have instincts?
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Vijay, Raghavan, and thank you all our very distinguished panelists. I think all of us would agree that this has been a very stimulating and very educative session. Thank you very much.